Okay, well, looks like we're live now, and I'm here with Dan Abbott from Reef Check. I'm Tom Calvanese. I'm the coordinator of the Oregon Kelp Alliance, and tonight we're going to be talking about kelp restoration projects in California and a new project that's getting started in Oregon. And hope you all out there will enjoy this presentation, and we'll have questions and answers at the end. But during the presentations, feel free to put questions in the Q&A box, and we will answer those when we get to them. So, Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can, add anything to your introduction that I missed. But I'll let you take it away, and then I'll follow you, and we'll do Q&A at the end.
All right, great. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so I'm super excited to be here talking to all of you. I got a presentation that I'm going to give, so let me go ahead and share my screen. Basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about like Reef Check and kind of what we do and what our plans are for expanding into Oregon, and about kind of kelp forests and urchin barrens that have been such a big issue lately, and kind of what we hope to accomplish on those lines. So first, let me just start off with some background with Reef Check. This will be brief. It's not going to be a history lesson. But so the Reef Check Foundation has been around since 1996, and for most of that time, they were really focused on coral reefs. They were kind of trying to get a picture of what the health of coral reefs were globally. At the time, there was a lot of individual studies here and there looking at one organism or one reef, but nobody had tried to get a global picture. So that's kind of what the Reef Check goal was. And to do that, instead of paying a bunch of PhDs to fly around the world and do studies, they use local communities. So they train citizen scientists to go around and survey these reefs using kind of a pretty like simplified method, just looking at a handful of fish, a handful of invertebrates, a handful of corals and substrates. Basically just kind of a few key things to kind of get a picture of the health of the reef. Currently they're active all over the world, and one of the things that this data has been really useful in bringing to light is that these coral bleaching events that I'm sure most of you have heard about, they aren't just like individual problems at certain sites. It's really a global phenomenon. So in 2006, we started a temperate program in California, and the goals were kind of the same, basically to expand on like the body of knowledge that was out there on health of our nearshore ecosystems. A little bit different than the coral program. So in the temperate environment, or in California anyways, there wasn't really the same need for that kind of large quantity, but maybe not very high quality in terms of number of organisms. So the temperate program ended up looking at a lot more species. So on the coral program, where you just had like 8 to 10 in each of these categories, the temperate program kind of looked at a much larger number of species. But that said, the methodology was the same. So it relied on primarily just recreational scuba divers who are willing to undertake this training and kind of collect data on the health of their dive sites and give back to the ocean and these kelp forest ecosystems. So fast forward a little bit. So here we are, 2021, just entering our 15th year of monitoring in California. And we're pretty proud of what we've done. So, one of the big roles was to to monitor the health of marine protected areas. So there's a whole bunch of, the big network of marine protected areas in California, not unlike the system you have in Oregon. So we have a lot of sites inside and outside of those, kind of measuring the health. So last year, or 2018, which is kind of our peak. Last year we did fewer surveys because of COVID, but 2018 we did 123 surveys, all up and down the coast. And then of course the other thing that happened recently, which I'll be talking more about, is these kelp forest restoration projects. So we saw some pretty big changes the past couple of years. That's something that we've gotten into more recently. But it also occurred to us that that the coastline extends beyond the state of California. It took us a little while to come to that realization. And you can't see it that well on this map, but if you look closely, you'll notice both here and here, the coastline does indeed go beyond the state. And of course, these kelp forests, they don't care about political boundaries, and so we started to look beyond the borders of our state. So we've been kind of trying to push up into Oregon, really since 2019. 2020, we did kind of our first surveys as part of the Nelly's Cove and Port Orford as part of that effort there. And the first training class in Oregon is currently underway in Port Orford, and there will be more to come. So our kind of goals in Oregon is first, just like we did in California, is to kind of monitor these health of these MPAs. ODFW does this, but I think they would like help. It's a big task. There's a lot of coastline to cover, and they don't always have all the data that they want. So here's like an example of one of the MPAs that would be looking at surveying the redfish rocks. But the other thing to note, and the other big thing that we're interested in, is supporting these kelp forest restoration efforts, or these urchin removal efforts. And so that's why we started with Port Orford and in conjunction with Tom and the Oregon Kelp Alliance. So let me change gears a little bit and kind of talk about the 15 years of monitoring that we've done and what we've seen in that time. So, I would say that, when we started in 2006, like that whole period from 2006 to 2013, nothing really changed. We went and, every year we'd go and we count, sea stars and kelp, and, there's a little bit of variation here and there, but there weren't any kind of drastic changes. And of course, all that really changed in late 2013 and really showed up in our data in 2014, starting with sea star wasting disease, which of course had a huge impact on all sorts of sea stars, but in particular the giant sunflower star. So that was kind of the first thing. Then this huge boom in purple urchins, just skyrocketing, and some of our sites went, from almost zero to, super high numbers. And of course, all this, correlated with these warm temps, this 2014, 2015 marine heat waves, which is, bad for kelp, or, the warm nutrient rich water is, not always that great for kelp. So we saw, with the, loss of stars and the big increase in purple urchins, kelp numbers just really crashed, and not everything went with it, but certain animals, in particular abalone, we just slowly saw year after year get fewer and fewer numbers, and coming out of their hiding holes looking for food, and then looking kind of wasted, and looking the body index was really low, and finally just washing up on shore. So it's kind of this whole ecological chain that we kind of witnessed firsthand as divers, which most of the folks in the state really aren't aware of. And yeah, so all these things are connected. So just like that story I just told, like one thing connects to something else, and the end result was just this, massive change in ecosystems where, you pull enough, strings, or, you take out, enough bricks out of the walls of these ecosystems, and they really transform. And so we saw this like massive transformation from kelp forest ecosystems to urchin barrens. And it varied kind of throughout the state. Up on the north coast, Mendocino County and Sonoma County, we saw, really, really, really dramatic loss in kelp. Like the, papers are out recently say 95% kelp loss, which is pretty dramatic. And if you think about the players here, so we lost otters a long time ago. Here, hold on, I got a pop-up window. There we go. So we hunted otters to extinction back, turn of last century. Sunflower stars disappeared due to sea star wasting disease. Massive explosion of urchins. Kelp, all but disappeared. 95% reduction, and finally abalone were severely hit. I mean, there's definitely still abalone there, but nowhere near the numbers that there once was. In Central California, in Monterey, and by the way, these are kind of the two areas I'm going to be talking about when we're talking about our restoration projects. But in Monterey, we do have otters, so that's good. We don't have sunflower stars. Like, no one has seen one in the entire state in a few years. But definitely a lot of urchins, loss of kelp. It's more patchy. It's not like the North Coast where you have a 95% reduction. I don't actually know what the percent is in the Central Coast, but in the Monterey Peninsula, I'd probably say it's 60%, just offhand. So recently we've been, thinking about kelp restoration, and we've gotten involved with a whole bunch of different projects looking at removing urchins or smashing urchins in the hope that that kelp can come back. And if you think about all those components of the ecosystem, we may not be able to, bring back sunflower stars. I know there's folks working on it. I know there's folks in Oregon working on it. But it's not something that, there's all these different pieces of the puzzle, right? And so removing urchins would be one piece of that puzzle. So let me talk a little bit about kelp restoration, just in general. And the first thing that I want to say that there's really like two components. There's the culling or removal of urchins, and there's the monitoring. And we always tend to think about the culling, but less so about the monitoring. And I really believe they're like kind of like equal partners and have kind of equal in importance. The monitoring does a number of things. So one, it measures the success of the project. So if you go out there and do a bunch of work, you want to know if it works, right? It can also kind of direct effort, right? So if you go out there and you cull a bunch of urchins and then you go out there and do some monitoring, you're like, okay, well, this area is clear, we're good, or maybe there's still a bunch of urchins there, or urchins moved in. So it kind of gives feedback to that process. It also legitimizes the effort to management agencies, and that's important because I'm going to talk about in a second that all these culling efforts have to get approval in some form. So to have that monitoring in place is a pretty key component. And finally, you learn lessons if the project doesn't work. And we have had projects down here that haven't worked for one reason or another, and I'm going to be talking about those. But it was because of the monitoring is how we learned what it was that didn't work. Culling, I don't think I have to explain why this works or how it works. But I do just want to point out that all culling efforts have to be, there has to be some legal framework for them. So one is a scientific take permit where, you basically fill out a permit form, and, whoever Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife kind of grants you permission to, remove urchins. And that's definitely a route that we have used in California. Another one is just a recreational rule change. So in California, the urchin limit statewide used to be 35 per day. And if you've been in an urchin barren, you know that 35 per day is not going to get you very far. So over the years, due to pressure from like the recreational dive community, they've upped those limits to 5 gallons, 10 gallons, larger and larger amounts. And then the last one is commercial fishing. So, and this one actually isn't even a rule change. Commercial fishermen are, I guess it depends, but at least in our efforts, they're allowed to take urchins. So they can go out and kind of harvest large numbers without any implications. So now I'm going to shift gears and I'm going to talk about the restoration efforts or the urchin removal efforts that we have done in California. And when I say we, I don't mean Reef Check. I just mean like the dive community. We've been involved in all of them in some capacity, but we haven't really been the drivers for most of them. So I don't want to give the impression that, I'm taking credit for something that we did not do. So the first efforts were these kind of urchin removal events put on by the Watermen's Alliance. It started in 2018, went into 2019. These were like recreational rule changes. At the time, recreational fishermen weren't allowed to smash urchins, and so they had to land them. They actually had to bring them back to shore. And this only extended to purple urchins, not reds. It was up in Mendocino and Sonoma, which is bull kelp. And yeah, and what they would do is they would pick a cove or a site, and they would have these massive events. And I mean, they were really successful, like 60, 80 divers perhaps would show up, dive 2 days. They had, tremendous amount of effort with people like, bringing urchins up in buckets and kayakers bringing them to shore. It was like this whole operation. But that said, like, we didn't really see any big effect from this. And so I think, these were kind of the first efforts, and we learned kind of a lot. One is just that there's a lot of urchins, and we would go in and monitor these sites after these events, and the numbers were, I mean, you couldn't really tell. I mean, there were just still so many urchins left. So there's a lot of urchins. Removals is a lot of work, especially for recreational divers. So it's not really feasible for recreational divers to land urchins and make a big impact. And then the other thing is that these efforts really need to be coordinated because of the number of urchins. Like, you really need to pick a site and not just go there one weekend and then move on to another site and maybe come back to that site a couple months later. You really need to pick a site and clear it like methodically and go back at same location again and again and again. The next project is one that really was us. So this was a Reef Check site, but it was more of an experiment. It wasn't a large scale restoration project. And this is at Lover's Point in Monterey. It started in 2019 and we're just going into our third year now. And for this one, we had 20 plots or 20, pieces of reef surrounded by sand. And what we're trying to do was take every one of these plots down to a different density of urchins to see at what density kelp would regrow. It was, this one was under a scientific collecting permit. So that was kind of the framework. We were allowed to smash. And in the beginning, we just smashed purple urchins. But in 2019, these the first year, we cleared all the purples. But by the end of the year, they were just covered in red urchins. And so the following year, we amended our permit to get permission to remove reds as well. We did all the work. We did all the monitoring. Some of the lessons we learned is one, urchins move. They move across sand. Like, we thought sand would be a good barrier, but it ended up not being the case. I mean, I think it is a barrier, but it still took a lot of effort and a lot of maintenance to go back and clear these plots and keep those densities low. And then of course we learned that red urchins can be a problem. I don't think they're always a problem, and I don't think we've seen this at most of our other sites, but definitely at this one, red urchins, they could not be ignored for sure. Here's just a quick example of one of those plots. So this whole rock, the target density was to get it down to less than 2 purple urchins on the whole rock. And we did have a little bit of growth. Moving on, so next one, this is back up in Mendocino County. So that Watermen's Alliance group, they kind of modified their efforts based on what they had learned. And they picked a particular cove, Casper Cove. They targeted divers to smash them. So, like basically they took the lessons from those earlier efforts and applied it to Casper. It started in 2020, which unfortunately was not a good year to start these projects just because of COVID. And so it was, there was travel bans and it was kind of hard for folks to get out there. But that said, they still went out and, smashed a bunch of urchins. This one was kind of again, a recreational rule change. They are only allowed to target purples, but I don't think we've really seen an increase of reds there. So it's not really that big of a deal. So even though it started last year due to COVID and everything, we don't really have a whole lot of results to talk about yet, but it's definitely a exciting process. And then moving on, we just got 2 more here. So this one is also kind of a reef check run one. And so this is in Mendocino County. There was actually 2 sites, but there was one site we started last year, and they were starting up another one this year. And this was actually like a large-scale restoration effort where we basically roped off an area, roughly 10 acres, and paid commercial fishermen. We got a huge grant from the state to fund like commercial fishermen to remove urchins from this plot. So they were just there, day after day, like on their boats. They were landing urchins. That wasn't really feasible for recreational divers, but of course, commercial fishermen are definitely set up for that. The project was really targeted at purples. That's what we're kind of paying them to remove. But they were allowed to remove reds as well. And so this is kind of a historical red urchin fishing ground anyways. So even though reds weren't really targeted as part of our restoration effort, they were still targeted as part of the fishing effort. So in that way, you kind of got both of them. That said, we haven't really seen any kind of big change in the red urchins. So yeah, this is bull kelp. Commercial fishermen did it. We're in charge of the monitoring. We got a late start last year, due to the shutdown and everything. So we didn't really see like a whole lot of kelp grow last year. Kelp grows best in the spring, and that's kind of the main season. So we're hoping this year, that if we're starting the season with a clean slate, we'll have more results. All right, and then finally, our last project that I want to talk about is at Tankers Reef in Monterey. This is actually probably the one that I'm most directly involved with, or at least have been in the past months. So this is an effort from recreational divers. So they push really hard to get that same rule change that was in effect in Mendocino to get it in effect in Monterey. And so they've, cleared kind of so we've roped off like a really, really big area, about 2.5 acres. And yeah, they're allowed to go out there and smash urchins. They can remove both purples and reds. It's a giant kelp and is really driven by the recreational dive community, with the caveat that like a lot of those recreational divers are reef check divers. So there's a lot of crossover. And then for the monitoring, this one is going to be pretty well studied, where we have kind of a partnership between NOAA and Reef Check and CDFW divers. And I don't want to talk too much about this one. This is the Oregon one, because this is kind of Tom's this game. This is what he's going to talk about. So just kind of stay tuned on this one. But yeah, so this is kind of what we're moving into next. And I just want to kind of end on a quick like ecological note, which is that, these these ecosystems we call kelp forests because they resemble forest on land, but in other aspects, they're actually much more like a grassland. You know, if a forest on land is clear cut, it's not going to grow back, at least not the way that it was for a long, long time. You know, it can take 100 years to get like another kind of climax forest again. Whereas kelp forest, they're not like that. They're really more like a grassland, and they have this quality called resilience, which is the, you know, ability to quickly recover from some event. So given the right conditions, if you know, if the water is cold and, you know, there's not too many urchins, and maybe you have sea otters or sunflower stars, if the conditions are right, they can really come back in a you know, very, very rapid manner. And so I think that's what we're hopeful will happen with these efforts, and we hope that these efforts kind of shepherd that process along. Okay, well, with that, I am going to turn it over to Tom.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Dan. That was great. I'm going to go ahead and excuse me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and kind of pick up where Dan left off. And just so everybody knows in the audience that at the end of my presentation, we'll switch over to some Q&A. And if you have questions now, go ahead and put them into the Q&A box, and we'll kind of monitor that. And we'll get to those questions at the end of my piece, which isn't going to be too lengthy. So just to basically introduce you all, the Oregon Kelp Alliance. Good, we already have some questions, cool. So we're going to get to that, Dustin, in a few minutes. So yeah, I'm Tom Calvanese. I work for Oregon State University here in Port Orford. I manage the Port Orford Field Station, and I also am the coordinator for the Oregon Kelp Alliance. And you've just heard a little bit about that from Dan. We're really excited about this partnership because it just sort of was kind of synchronicity, I guess I'll call it, that Dan was scouting out sites for reef check in this area while we were starting to think about what we might do about this problem in Oregon that we were seeing kind of headed our way from California. And lo and behold, it just sort of all kind of came together. And as you just heard from Dan, we'll be getting into that project here pretty soon. That's sort of already underway. So these are just some photos that we've taken, or I guess I took all these from right around here. To the left, there's a small stand of kelp just south of Mount Humbug, which is sort of right behind me. The middle photo is one of our interns that was here last summer getting an immersive experience at the Redfish Rocks Marine Reserve, quite literally. And the photo to the right was taken nearby at Titchener Cove, which is just adjacent to Nelly's Cove, and a place where you can see that sort of, large population of purple urchins. So I'm going to figure out how to advance slides. So the Oregon Kelp Alliance, essentially, we're working to promote healthy kelp forests, and that means a lot of things. But one thing it means right now is working on this kelp restoration / urchin removal initiative. And it's an alliance of a pretty diverse group of folks that include commercial urchin divers and Indian tribal members, scientists, researchers, managers, conservationists, eco-tour guides, sport divers, chefs, and other community members who are all really invested in the health of Oregon's kelp forests. And this is just a sort of a laundry list, if you will, of some of the different partners and organizations that are part of this alliance or engaged with it in some way. Oregon Sea Grant funded the initial sort of time to put this alliance together. The Oregon Wildlife Foundation has provided a little funding for some pilot efforts to culture urchins using edible dulse, and the Pew Charitable Trust is supporting some of these early pilot efforts that we're engaged in this year. So, I like to give credit where it's due, and uh, really the commercial urchin divers in Oregon really started to bring this up back in 2016 when they started to see changes in the urchin harvest. On the left there, the fishing vessel Mach 1, which is the commercial urchin diving vessel, with a nice load of healthy red sea urchins harvested from Orford Reef, which you see to the right, which has not produced marketable sea urchin for the last few years, and urchin divers just haven't been diving there because of that. And as Dan mentioned, we can sort of trace this back to several phenomena. This is just a rendering of what came to be known as the warm blob that occurred in 2014, 15, 16, that brought this really nutrient poor warm water close to shore. And of course, that has an influence on the health of kelp itself, because kelp really likes that cold, nutrient-rich water that it actually derives its nutrients from. And with this came the effect on these sunflower stars, which are major predators of sea urchins. So now we're seeing this is a healthy population, but along with that warm water came the sunflower stars and other stars dying from wasting disease. That was, we believe, was related to some of that warming. So now we've lost predators. As Dan mentioned, 100 years ago, we lost another major predator on the Oregon coast of sea urchins, which was the sea otter. So now you have not a lot of predators, not good conditions for kelp. And some of you may have seen this Rogers Bennett and Catton paper from 2019 that sort of laid it out, I think, in a good way in this figure. Very visually saw the changes that occurred in the 14, 15, and 16 years during those warm water years, poor kelp recruitment, and of course that study was a California study, so it sort of stopped on that imaginary line between California and Oregon that Dan was talking about, and which ecosystems know nothing about. And so up in Oregon, we were seeing what we were seeing down in California, starting to see that happen in Oregon, starting to get concerned and started to think about what to do about it. And up in Oregon, there were a series of aerial kelp surveys that were done. This one is of the Orford Reef, Port Orford Heads, Redfish Rocks region. And what you see here in this is aerial kelp surveys from 1990 to 2011. That's the last time an aerial survey was done. And what this is showing you is the kelp coverage during those years, and the darker, the more kelp there was over that period. And this is one of the things that we're really interested in getting into some aerial monitoring of kelp cover along the Oregon coast, just to help inform sort of what are we dealing with here, because it's not a sort of uniform situation. It's patchy, and in some places there's healthy kelp beds, in some places there's not. So trying to get some clarity on that, drill down into the details. And then, of course, there's the urchin populations. On the upper graph is a series of surveys that were done by ODFW and commercial urchin divers, showing urchin densities primarily of red urchin until about 2000, that same period, right on 2016, skipped a few years, did another survey in 2019. These are at Orford Reef and show that that sudden high density of purple urchins and also of reds at the same time, but really hadn't seen that kind of density of purple urchins going all the way back to 1984. So this seemed to be, this was a pretty unusual recruitment event. And then at the graph on the bottom is of redfish rocks. showing again in increased urchin densities in 2019, which is when this last survey was done there. Not as high as Orford Reef, but still elevated. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, bring things up to current, and show you a few images of some work, some images leading up to some work that we did last year when the stars sort of aligned after the wildfires cleared, and we figured out how to function in the context of COVID. And I'll share some of that with you and then talk about where we're headed. So this is an image from Nellie's Cove that Dan showed you a map of this, and I'll show you another one in a minute. And this is showing you what it looked like in 2017 during a kayak tour operated by our friend Dave Lacey, who runs South Coast Tours and is one of the partners in the Oregon Kelp Alliance. So here you're seeing some pretty healthy kelp beds in Nellie's Cove. And then you saw this photo at the beginning in the adjacent cove, Titchener Cove. We see a lot of this last year where we don't see any kelp, and we see a lot of purple urchins and one red urchin there. So as I said, when we sort of made it through the summer, there was a lot of pent up interest in sort of getting something going and starting this project, particularly at Nellie's Cove, and wanted to really focus on getting some baseline monitoring work done. And this is where Dan and Reef Check came into the picture and really pulled off a pretty intensive effort, along with a whole bunch of other folks, to come together and do that, initiate this kelp restoration pilot, urchin culling pilot, by monitoring this experimental area at Nellie's Cove at Orford Heads. And the photo in the upper right was taken by fantastic underwater photographer Laura Tessler, who I think is on the call and is also in Dan's Reef Check class, and is a real champion and a great person to have engaged in our Kelp Alliance work. Here's a shot, I think that's you, Dan, loading some gear up on the Black Pearl to get ready to do that monitoring work, working with South Coast Tours. And this is a map of the experimental area at Nellie's Cove, which is sort of split into these two, kind of neatly into these two mini coves. And those numbers are from that baseline work that Reef Check did last October. And you can see pretty high densities of purple urchins in both sides of the cove and zero kelp. We also had scientific divers in the water at doing 4 surveys at 4 sites with very similar results. And this site has now, the baseline work has been done, and we're now preparing to begin the culling work that we're going to be doing as part of this project. So as Dan mentioned, it wasn't long before we started to talk about other sites in Oregon where people were seeing similar phenomena and generating interest in pursuing a project like this. And we decided as a group, and with the advice of ODFW, that the approach that would be I guess would be the quickest would be to pursue a scientific taking permit through ODFW. And so that's what we've done. And now the project has expanded to these other sites. From the north at Cape Lookout, Haystack Rock in Pacific City, South Cove at Cape Arago, Nellie's Cove that we just talked about here in Port Orford, and Macklin Cove in Brookings. And I'll just show you those area maps for each site. So here's the Cape Lookout site. And each of these maps was sort of developed in partnership with local divers and partners that were interested in participating in the project, and having noticed that and identified it as a site that could use this sort of attention. So here's the Cape Lookout site, treatment and control, the Haystack Rock site. And I just wanted to share these photos of the Cape Arago site, South Cove, because it's really interesting that you have right alongside each other, you have these pretty thick kelp forest areas, like you see on the left, where you can literally crawl over that kelp. It's that thick. But just adjacent to that, what you see is what you see on the right, where you see a high density of purple urchins. And they seem to be pretty content to hang out where they are. They're kind of, a lot of them appear in these areas where these sort of pits, and they appear to be pretty stationary. And so we're pretty curious about that. And another, it sort of lends itself to the argument about why you want to really monitor the area before you proceed with that kind of intervention. And that's what we've agreed to and what ODFW has approved. And this is what the map looks like at the Arago site. And the last site to the south is Macklin Cove in Brookings. And this is what the study site looks like, the map looks like there. So we're ready to launch this experimental kelp restoration project for 2021. And the scientific taking permit is going to allow experimental culling of urchins in these target areas based on the results of the baseline monitoring that's done. The monitoring that's already been done at Ellie's Cove means that that can proceed. And we're using a before-after control impact study design. So monitor before, monitor after, have a treatment area and a control area. And then you just saw the 5 sites. And these are some of the coordinators that we're working with at each of those sites. And actually, as of today, the permit was approved. So it's time for us to get busy working out the details of the logistics, the details of the survey and the culling methods with all of our partners. And I'm just going to share with you a few details from the permit, which literally got approved a few hours ago. And I just thought I'd share with you some of the details so you have a little bit of a deeper understanding. So what we have in the permit is a baseline survey of purple and red urchins, kelp of course, also red and flat abalone, and the sunflower sea stars. All those sort of players in the system that we've referred to during both Dan's talk and mine. As I mentioned, ODFW has agreed that the culling can be allowed based on the findings of the survey, and the Nellie's Cove survey is showing clearly that the culling is a potential reasonable approach to trying to deal with this issue. The other sites are being scheduled for the surveys, and we're talking about culling in place by smashing and following techniques that others have used, as you've just seen and heard from Dan. And that'll occur where it's permitted, and that'll be a decision point that actually, I think ODFW is going to be responsible for making those decisions. And then a couple of things we'll be doing to address some other questions are sampling some purple urchins to look at reproductive status and seasonality of the development of their uni or gonads, and also looking at installing some oxygen sensors to measure dissolved oxygen before and after culling events, to just measure any potential effect of culling on oxygen levels. So just so you know, there's some other things we're thinking about at ORKA, including open ocean restoration efforts. We think there may be some opportunity following some of this culling work to look at, well, do we see natural regeneration? Is there room for some sort of assisted regeneration or even culturing of kelp, open ocean mariculture? So we're thinking about things like that as well. And I want to give a plug for another webinar that's happening tomorrow, in case you haven't heard enough. This one is the American Society for Environmental History. And this has been organized by Anne Velisis, author of a great book called Abalone. And she is leading a panel that includes Jenny Selgrath of NOAA Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, Cameron LaFollette of the ORKA Alliance, and myself. And they'll be covering mostly the history of sort of all of this, how did we get here? And then I'll be talking more about some of what I just talked about, sort of like, okay, now that we're here, what can we learn from that history, and that might inform us as we go forward into this sort of uncertain future. So that's what I have to say. Here's where you can learn more. Go to OregonKelp.com. You can also sign up to a mailing list there to learn more as we go forward. That's some of my contact information. If you miss that, you can also find it on the Port Orford Field Station website. And pretty picture for the end. And this is a part where we turn our attention to all of you and start answering questions that have started to come in. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I believe we can also make it so that you can talk, or I think we can even make you a presenter. So if you want to have a more of a face-to-face conversation. And Dan, I'm going to get started, and I don't know, I'm just going to start with, they're all coming in around the same time. So I'm going to start with Don McCoy, and I'm going to ask Dan, and maybe the two of us can tag team this one. Why does the project stop in Oregon? What about Washington? Want to give that a swing, Dan?
Yeah, no reason. I mean, I don't think it does. I think we're looking at Washington too. I'm personally not as familiar with Washington. I have talked to a lot of folks up in Puget Sound who definitely saw you know, two-star wasting, and folks are looking at that. I'm not aware of any you know, urchin removal efforts up there, but there definitely could be. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'll just agree with Dan and also share that we've also been in touch with an international group, the International Kelp Alliance, I think it's called, and I might have that wrong, but there are people around the world looking at this problem, from New Zealand to the west coast of North America to even Japan, Norway. So, you know, I think this is not you know, we're looking at it on a very local level, but it's really you know, a global concern. And so I think we're going to increasingly see more and more attention being paid to this phenomenon and what we can do about it, if anything. And I think that one of the take homes here is one of the things we're trying to achieve is to establish and maintain these sort of oases of kelp forests that are healthy and productive and can produce spore that could reseed nearby areas under better conditions, assuming that things may not get better before they, you know, right away. But we want to sort of work in the direction of, you know, things get conditions of health, conditions that would promote or support healthy kelp forest habitats being there again in the future. So I don't know, Dan, do you want to take turns picking questions?
Sure.
Ad hoc.
Yeah. Jess asked, hey, thanks, Dan and Tom. I'm curious as to whether there are other restoration approaches other than urchin smashing. I think Tom actually probably talked a little bit about the mariculture efforts after you asked that. There's removals as well, in addition to smashing. I know there's been other ideas that have been floated, like you know, definitely when I think about these ecosystems, I think about them as this like complex web. You know, they're very dynamic webs, and so, you know, like I kind of mentioned earlier, you know, these removal events or efforts are really just directed at kind of one string in that strand. And there's other ways too. So I know there's folks that are, you know, looking at seeding kelp. You know, we're doing some, in fact, they're even doing some experiments on that in Mendocino at our project site there. There's also efforts underway to, you know, captive breed sunflower stars, which would be super cool. You know, I think it's pretty early days, so, you know, not a silver bullet by long shot, but that'd be kind of a big thing if we could bring those back and release them out into the ecosystems. There's also been talk of efforts to like feed urchins. One of the kind of interesting dynamics of this is that uh, the urchins, it's really a behavioral change in the urchins. Like what a urchin really wants to do is like hide back in a crack and eat drift algae that comes by, and in a normal kelp forest, there's drift algae, abundant. So there can be, there's some sites that have incredibly uh, high densities of urchins, but are still, really robust kelp forests just because the urchins are being fed and they're not changing that active state. So there's talk of, putting down, bags of kelp as barriers, to kind of feed these urchins and protect areas. So yeah, so there's oh, and then sea otters. I think someone just brought up a question about that or asked it. So yeah, there's kind of a lot of different ideas to get at these like different pieces of this puzzle.
Yeah, and one thing I'll just add quickly to that is, since Dan mentioned it, we are working in partnership with the ORKA Alliance, and they're really focused on this potential reintroduction of sea otters as a piece of this equation. And yeah, I'm we're paying attention to that too, and think that that's worth exploring. And it's going to take a lot of time. And some of the early models that they're coming up with are showing, decades of time before there would be sort of an actual effect of that. And so what we're looking at is really, okay, that's great, and maybe that's going to work out someday in the future, but what are we going to do now? And sort of integrating these different time horizons and thinking about this thing as an integrated sort of effort. I'm going to go to the next person, and I figured out that I can allow people to talk on the webinar. So this one is from Jeff, and I'll read it, but then if you want to speak, go ahead. So any measurements or scientific explanation of the potential of spread due to smashing the purples that have fecund zygotes versus empties? So that's one of the things that we are going to be paying attention to, and why we're going to be subsampling the purple urchins and actually looking at the gonadal index and the reproductive state of the urchins as we go through that. That's going to help us get a sense of that, what is the potential for that? Dan, I don't know if you've seen any evidence of that in any of the projects you've been part of, but it's something that the question has come up, and so we are sort of building that into the experimental design. Sorry. And I don't know, Jeff, if you want to add anything to that, or Dan, if you can enlighten us on any of that based on your experience.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would just real quickly say that I think it is a concern. It's not something that we've seen evidence for. So it's something that could potentially happen. And I think back on one of those slides, I had mentioned, one of the reasons that we do these studies is to look for unintended consequences, and that would definitely be one of them. Most of the, I'm trying to think if it's most or all. I think it's, maybe with the exception of Casper Cove, all the other removal efforts, we do look at gonads and take data on that, and with very few exceptions, these urchins are starving with very 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 low gonad indexes.
Cool. So I see another one here by Dustin Miller. Is there a difference in effectiveness to removing urchins in a random location versus on the edge of existing forests? And Dustin, I'm going ahead and doing the same thing. So if you want to speak, I think I just figured it out so that you can. And okay. I think it's a great question. Do you want to expand on that at all, or? Um,
Well, I guess I'll talk just to break it up a little bit, if that's
yeah,
okay.
yeah, go ahead.
Um,
I appreciate that.
sure. Well, I guess my question is, and you know, kind of answered it, like healthy kelp can live next to healthy urchins. But in areas where you see that sort of damage or the kelp being kind of encroached by urchins, you know, is it better to stop them in their path or just go pick a spot and start blanket weeding, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it gets at like a lot of different things. So on one hand, like if you have urchins in a kelp forest next to a barren, you might be, you know, you might want to go in there and remove those urchins, right? But these are native species doing like their normal thing. Like sea urchins are a normal, healthy part of a functioning kelp forest ecosystem. So those urchins you wouldn't necessarily want to remove. But to your question, there will be like a border. And one thing that we have not seen in Central and Northern California is urchins kind of like moving as a front. There's been kind of reports of that, but we haven't seen them kind of moving and mowing down kelp forests. It's more like they just kind of, you know, come from within the forest. And one thing that you will see is these areas where there's a barren on one side and a kelp forest on the other, and there's just a line of urchins that just like borders the kelp forest, and all those urchins have kind of switched to that passive feeding. So it's kind of crazy because you're like, wow, there's so many urchins, and they'll even kind of bunch up there, but then they'll just stop. Like as soon as they get a good meal, they're like, okay, well, I'm done. I'm just gonna chill here now. And they just wait. And so you can have these areas where you have barrens with like hungry, starving urchins, and kelp forests with like little or no urchins, and those areas can persist like that for years on end.
Good answer, Dan. I'm going to go to the next question from Kelsey Miller. Hi, Kelsey. I just unlocked your mic, so you want to ask? I'll read your question, and then you can add if you like. How deep do the barrens extend, and what are the closest source populations for the kelp? Are you seeing turf coming in post-removal? So Dan, I'm going to let you take that one again, and I might have something to add to it, but I'm pretty early in the game here.
Yeah, I mean the barrens are huge. I mean, in like Northern California, I mean it's just miles and miles of coastline with small isolated patches of of, of kelp. One thing that we do know, and I'm not sure this is where you get at in your question, but once you remove urchins, or if an area is cleared for whatever reason, the how close there is existing kelp, um, it has a big impact on how quickly that place repopulates, which is important to point out that the point of these efforts isn't really to restore kelp along the entire coast. I mean, it's just way too much of a undertaking. It's really kind of make these like little oases, as Tom says, these little islands of kelp, so that if conditions do change and urchins do die off from disease or predators or for whatever reason, the kelp can come back quickly. As far as turf coming back, I mean, we are seeing uh, kelp and other algae grow to varying degrees at our various sites. It's kind of mixed, and we haven't seen like like a huge shift from like barren to kelp, which is what we really want to see. But we've definitely seen like young kelp grow, and then maybe it gets eaten later, and we do see more turf algae. There's even signs, or some signs, that in some of our areas, like at Noyo, some of the urchins might be kind of switching to more passive feeding, which would be good. So those are kind of some of the results that we're seeing so far. Stay tuned.
Oh, that's great. I was just part of my question was just wondering, are the orchid barrens extending into super deep waters?
Right.
Or is there kind of like a
Yeah, they can definitely go pretty deep. Uh, I mean, at least in most of our sites, the reef only goes out so far, then it just becomes sand, and so obviously they don't go out that far. And another thing that we've really seen, well, okay, so it's pretty weird. There's sites in Monterey in particular where in Monterey it's really patchy, where you have some barrens and some kelp forest. And there's some areas where it's barrens out deep and kelp in shallow. But more common, and seems like more common over time, is that the urchins, as they um, start to starve or whatever, become hungrier, they move in shallower. And so one thing we've seen in Monterey is urchins move in shallow, really shallow. Like the shallows would be like super dense. And then as you go out deeper, there's fewer and fewer. And we've actually seen kelp kind of return into some of those deeper areas.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I would add to that is, just in talking with commercial urchin divers who typically, at least out at Orford Reef, work in fairly deep water, I know that they have reported uh, definitely some urchin barren uh, sort of phenomena there. So I guess it's a question of how deep. But I think there's definitely some evidence that we're seeing the effects of this massive recruitment pulse of purple urchins in those deep water kelp forests out at the commercial urchin grounds. I'm going to go to Zach Benier, who's got a question, and I think I made it so you can speak, Zach, if you'd like to. Will reducing local urchin populations via culling prevent future urchin population booms, or can urchins disperse from farther away and repopulate after culling? And yeah, that's a tough one, and
Yeah.
a very good question. I think that I think you're putting your finger on one of the challenges, right? That you can do all this work, and then kelp spores and urchin larvae are being dispersed by currents, and that could occur over significant distances. And so, over the period of years, let's say, if there were a big recruitment pulse of urchins, that you would, I don't know, Dan, maybe you've observed this in any of your projects, but I could imagine a situation where you could see a big recruitment pulse of urchins and suddenly see, a large number of very small urchins. And then the question is, how much of an effect is that going to have on the reseeding, if you will, of the kelp that's going to grow out annually, if it does? So that's an interesting question to sort of ponder. I'm not sure I have a super good answer for it, but I do think you're pointing out definitely a potential issue. I know,
Yeah.
Dan.
No, I think that's exactly right, Tom. And yeah, the purple urchin boom that we talk about and we showed graphs of, I mean, it's not well understood. Like we're not really sure why that happened when. If you look at the graphs, it looks like sunflower stars dropped off and urchin skyrocketed. But given the size that the urchins were when we started to count them, it seems that they recruited, they were born prior to the sea star wasting disease. So they don't, I mean, they might be related, but it doesn't, it definitely doesn't seem like that is the case. It is kind of how these ecosystems function. There is a bunch of randomness. I like to say that urchins, they breed like rabbits. Like they can increase dramatically, except that it's incredibly random, right? So it's like one year you might have 0 recruitment and no urchins, and the next year you might have 10, and the next year you might have 10,000. And the mechanisms or what causes that. I mean, I think they're not well understood, but I do think it just comes down to a lot of it is randomness. So again, like when you think of that ecosystem with all those different pieces, like definitely that urchin recruitment is one of them, and it's not one that we can control or even particularly understand particularly well.
Cool. I'm going to go to the next question from David Soyster, and I'm unmuting you as well and asking your question out loud, and feel free to chime in. David's question is, why haven't otters returned to Oregon waters as they've been protected for years? I would really defer to my colleagues at the ORKA Alliance on this one, but I'll take a stab at it, and Dan can chime in as well. I think a couple of reasons. One, that the otters, my understanding is that they don't move very quick, they don't move very rapidly as their population grows. It happens very slowly. So since they were extirpated from a very long section of the coast, the amount of time it would take for them to return to that place, hundreds of miles up the coast, is it's a very long timeline. And I think that's one of the reasons. And there are probably others and more about it that I probably don't understand, but I think that's the fundamental reason, is that they tend to not move very rapidly, even after they've been protected for years, but they've been protected from a place very, very far away. And one of the other problems that I think has been sort of revealed is that the otters also need some protection, and this is where the kelp forest, a healthy kelp forest, provides some of that protection to the otters from predators, such as sharks. And there's been, I think, some work done to show, like, oh, they'll go to the edge of the kelp bed, but when it's time to go swim this across some wide expanse of open water, they're much more vulnerable to predation and less likely to make it to that kelp bed far away. So I don't know, Dan, if you got more to
No, that's exactly right too. And we always think about otters as being this keystone species that protects kelp, but there's actually been papers recently that show it goes the other way as well, and that at least in California, the chief like the number one mortality of sea otters is white shark bites. And that correlates to loss of kelp. So when you don't have kelp, you have more bites. So it's actually the forest can protect the otters as well. And yeah, just to kind of expand on that a little bit, I can't speak of why northern otters haven't moved down this far, but I know the otters in California, they haven't even made it up to San Francisco Bay yet. They went down to very low numbers, turn of the century, and they're only just above 3,000 now. So there's not that many. And even though the population is expanding, and it has expanded as a result of this urchin boom of a lot more otter food, the range is really not expanding. And when you look at that increase in population of otters, it's really concentrated in the middle of their range, and the expansion has been just stymied. And I think part of that is due to white sharks and loss of habitat. And it brings up the question about relocation too, which is that, so otters are not a silver bullet either, right? So Monterey, we have a huge density of otters. And yet, and we do have kelp, and I think we have the otters to thank for that, at least in part. But there's tremendous barrens as well. And, the otters don't eat, it's been shown like very clearly that otters don't eat the urchins in the barren. So it's like, if you have a forest, the otters will help protect it. But if it's a barren, they're not going to go in there and clear out the urchins and make it into a kelp forest. Which brings up the issue with relocation, right? So if you don't have a healthy ecosystem already, you can't really move otters there because there's nothing for them to eat.
Yeah, it's another, big topic that's very much connected to how do you promote healthy kelp forests the otters are a major player, and as are many other organisms. And it's a big, complex problem that we're working on all together. I'm going to go to, it looks like at least 3 more questions, and one of them has multiple questions. I'm going to ask Brad Krim's question, which is, has any regulation been made or proposed for offshore commercial kelp mariculture? I can speak to this in part because I'm also a member of the Territorial Sea Plan's Rocky Habitat Working Group, which did produce, there were a couple of policies related to submerged aquatic vegetation, which is sort of the catch-all term that talks about kelp and seagrass, etc. And the policy that's in place as of now, I believe, is that no commercial harvest. The policy is to not promote commercial harvest, or not allow commercial harvest, I should say. And now that policy makes exceptions for research, education, and restoration. So I think somewhat of a ducking of the answer, but the best answer I can give you right now is that I think we're going to find out how that might be regulated once we engage in some, in earnest in projects that are going to have to do with kelp and restoration and regeneration and mariculture, and how it all fits together within the context of a policy that says no commercial harvest, but allows research, education, and restoration work. So stay tuned. There isn't anything active right now, but I don't think we're too far from a point where we start having those conversations. So I think we can look forward to some really interesting discussions about that. Question from Don McCoy, and Don, I'll do the same thing and unmute you if you want to speak here, because it looks like you have several questions. I'm going to try to run through all of them. And then we have some from Katie, and I see Kristen McHugh joined us, and she has a question. So Don's first question is, have you reached out to Reef and checked their surveys, and could they be used in monitoring? And my short answer is that has not happened yet, but I think it's a good idea and potential there. Dan, maybe you know more about that, or maybe you've worked with them in California. Maybe you can add to that.
I've definitely reached out to them, and I've talked with them. A lot of people get Reef and Reef Check mixed up for obvious reasons. I think the challenge with using the Reef data is that it's not a density number, so it's not transect based. You don't have a number over area. And I also just don't know if they've done kind of focused surveys on these areas. So to use like the type of data that we need for these projects is really density based and very focused in a very small area. I mean, like those maps Tom's were showing, those squares were, about 100 meters by 100 meters. So not particularly big areas. And then there's a treatment and control. So you need a bunch of like data in here and a bunch of data and there. And so, the Reef data, which is more, observational and, more like a census, I'm not sure would do particularly well at that for some things. For like sunflower stars, I think it's excellent, right? Because you have so many more eyes on the water. Like if Reef Check is just counting a transect, like Reef Divers are counting, like, they're looking all over the place. So like, it's kind of like each type of data has its own uses. So yeah, hope that answers your question.
Good answer. And another question from Don, have we contacted the CDOC Society out of University of California at Davis Veterinary School, but based on Orcas Island? And I am aware of them. I have not gotten that far down my list of people that I need to reach out to. I know, Dan, I don't know if you have, but it does sound like a good idea, especially as we're talking about this sort of coast-wide effort. I think there's definitely space for, just expanding the the group and talking more with others. We definitely are, as Dan mentioned, there are definitely lots of people talking about the pycnopodia or sunflower star concerns up and down the coast, and definitely lots of folks involved from Washington, Alaska, BC, etc. So I appreciate that suggestion, and definitely they're on the list. Dan, do you have experience working with them?
I don't. I've talked to them a little bit because we're also looking at work in Washington, and so I've talked to them about some of their protocols, but I haven't talked to them in regards to this.
Third question from Don, out of 4. I like your questions, Don. Good questions. What effect has the loss of kelp had on fish numbers? And we know that a lot of the commercially important species of fish in this area are like rockfish and lingcod, cabezon, and many of those species depend on the kelp forest habitat both as juveniles and adults. So we know that they really need that habitat, and the thing that we need to figure out is what do they do when that habitat's not there, besides go somewhere else? And how much do you lose that habitat before you start to see real effects on those fish populations? I'm a fish scientist, and so I'm super interested in this. And we're working on a proposal right now with Sea Grant, Oregon Sea Grant, to support this project going forward into next year, and potentially adding some additional components to the methods so that we can start looking at things like juvenile fish recruitment and comparisons. But I can tell you anecdotally that a place that I used to go kayak fishing at pretty frequently and pretty good track record of catching fish, I get skunked pretty frequently there now. And I know just from diving myself and from talking to other divers that the system is just very different. When the kelp is not there, it's just the fish are just not there. And so, again, it begs that question of what effect does that have? Well, they clearly go looking for better place to hang out. And then the question is that better place around? And how much do you lose before you lose the sort of critical mass of essential habitat of those fish populations? Definitely something we're super concerned about, and definitely going to be paying a lot of attention to going forward. And Dan, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think we've seen similar things, a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence about fewer fish. We haven't really seen anything pop up on our data yet, and we've really been looking for it. I think we really expected to see a big or significant decline in fish, and so far it hasn't really showed up. But it could just be a bit of a lag before it has a big effect.
Yeah, and I think again that you pan out from any particular location, you understand how patchy all of this is, so that in Oregon in particular, there are, again, like I said, there are places nearby here where one place is an urchin barren, and over there's a healthy kelp bed. And that just makes it more complicated, but also makes it more interesting, and there's more reason to take a closer look, I think, and think about, how do we get ahead of it before it's just all gone, if that's where things are headed, like they've been in Northern California. Last question from Don. A lot of us dive in British Columbia. I wonder how they are affected. They certainly have lost sunflower stars, but they do have sea otters, at least at the northern end. So I think that's an interesting observation. I don't think I can enlighten it much more than you have in your statement there. Maybe the presence of the otters in the absence of the sunflower stars are exerting some control over the urchin populations, and maybe that's keeping things from getting out of control. Certainly some recent work that was done by Josh Smith down in California is sort of pointing to that phenomenon that, well, if the otters are there and there's healthy kelp forest areas, they can help keep them healthy. But if there are barrens, they don't do a very good job of dealing with them because there's nothing inside for them to eat. So they're not super interested. But if you have that kind of patchy situation, that the otters could be playing that role of, even with the sunflower stars gone, at least you have a top predator there helping to maintain that system. There's a couple more questions. I want to try to get to everyone's questions, and thanks everyone for patience and listening to Dan and myself. Katie Turhar, I hope I said that right, and I will do the same and make you audible if you like to speak. And Katie's question is, hey guys, thanks for having this webinar. You're welcome. What do you think the future of kelp forests look like given the way the global climate is changing? Are the last few years an anomaly, or is this the new normal, quote unquote? Also, has working on this project and seeing the change in stable states affecting your mood or mental health? Dan, I'm going to make you answer that one first.
I mean, yeah. I mean, as somebody who thinks about this stuff kind of day in and day out, I think it does kind of affect your, mental health. I guess, like, I don't know. I feel like, I'm hopeful. These are very resilient ecosystems. They can bounce back really quickly. They can undergo a tremendous amount of change. I mean, I think we're going to see change. I think the world is changing. These urchin barrens are, they're not, they're not unheard of, right? Like urchin barrens have always been around, but like I like to make the analogy of like a clearing in a forest, but they're increasing in frequency and in duration and in scope. And so, I think that's something to think about. On the other hand, there's a lot of good news too. If you look at like marine mammals, like they're coming way back. Fish like lingcod, when I started diving, 30 years ago, were uncommon, and there's a lot more of those at least down here now. So there are good news, and given the kind of robustness of these ecosystems and the management steps we've taken, like Oregon and California have both done a great job of like making these marine protected areas. And I think that, if you can kind of like, strengthen those by, more biodiversity, and, if we can like breed sunflower stars or whatever, I guess I am hopeful that you can kind of bring these ecosystems back or make them stronger, or just kind of support them to do the thing that they do. And if you do that, then they are able to withstand like a lot of environmental change and can kind of spring back pretty quickly.
Yeah, I guess I'll echo what Dan said. Nobody has a crystal ball, right? But we see trends, and we're definitely, we're clearly seeing on the global level, there's some evidence of sort of a range migration of these cold water kelp species away from the equators toward the poles. I don't know about the new normal. Clearly, there's lots of variability, and so it's hard to sort of tease out how much of this is interannual variability and how much of it is a long-term trend. And then you add all these other ingredients into that complex equation that we've been talking about, the otters and the sea stars and the big recruitment pulse of urchins. And it's really hard to sort of point to one thing and say, well, this is the issue, or this is how it's going to look in the future. But I do think we can see some pretty good reasons to engage in this sort of restorative work. And I think that's what I think is, when I think about the future, I think about a lot more of this kind of work. in the future, where people start thinking in terms of active conservation efforts that are intended to regenerate, restore, and sort of bring balance back to a system, even if it might be a different kind of balance. So as far as how I feel about it, yeah, it can be daunting, and I think a lot of us feel that multiple levels. But for me, the things that help me out with that are to sort of act on it, to not be in despair, but to choose hope and think about, well, maybe it'll work and maybe it won't, but let's try something. And I'm big fan of, start where you are, use what you have, and do something. And that's a great recipe for dealing with those the feelings you get when you go to your favorite spot and it looks like wars, like it's just been decimated. And that can be tough to take when you appreciate it so much and get so much out of that experience, and to have that go away is tough. There's 3 more questions here from Tristan and Jeff and Laura. And Tristan, you were next in line, so I'm going to pitch it to you. And Tristan's question was, given it could take a while to see a full kelp forest recover post-removal and pending oceanographic conditions, how do you measure success in the larger context of kelp restoration research if kelp is not restored quickly? That's a tough question, Tristan. You're really asking the tough ones.
If I'm unmuted, I
are
guess,
unmuted. Yeah, please speak up.
I guess the impetus of that question. Oh, hi, Tom and Dan, by the way. Thank you so much for that.
Hi, Tristan.
And everything you both do. I suppose the reason I asked that question is sometimes on the scale of.
Oh, you went on mute.
I think you got muted again. I tried to make you a panelist, but.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. There you are. Hi.
Surprise.
People get to see someone besides myself and Dan.
I didn't think I was going to be there, but here it is.
Thanks for joining us.
No problem. So, yeah, I guess I was just asking that question because often when you start these sorts of projects, there are these expectations that you'll have immediate results. And we all know, I think on the grander scale, that sometimes just taking a stab at the idea and answering some of the questions or taking the time to develop the methods to do that is part of the study in itself. So if it were outside of ecological, the reaction that you end up seeing from the ecological side, how else would you measure success? I guess in your case, Tom, in Oregon, and then Dan, in your case, in California.
Yeah, I guess I would say that, the whole word success can be pretty elusive, right? It depends on who you ask. And, I like to use the example of marine reserves, right? So we establish marine reserves and then people start asking you, well, is it working? Is it successful? And we know that these ecological changes sometimes take a lot of time to manifest themselves. So right behind me is the Redfish Rocks Marine Reserve that will be in place for 10 years as of next year. And to a lot of folks around here, it already feels like, well, that was a long time ago. And when are we going to see success? Or is it successful? And, there's 2 ways to answer that. One is the long view answer, which is that these things take time. We're going to continue to measure it. It's really important to be engaged and keep doing the work and understand that these kinds of ecological changes occur over long time scales, especially in these kind of temperate environments. And the other way to answer that is to say, well, if part of the project was dependent on working with commercial fishermen and urchin divers and having an agreement that they're going to not harvest that area because that's part of the experiment, if you will. It's kind of a natural experiment. What did you do? You set up an experimental area and you said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to stop taking fish and urchins out of that area. What's going to happen? And so you could answer that question by saying, well, all of the success that may or may not occur in the future is all based on the success of that first part of the process, which is the agreement that we're going to do this and the continued commitment to refraining from extracting things from that area. So to me, you could say, well, there's a success to point to right there, because you've got a whole group of people whose actual livelihoods depend on extracting things, fish and sea urchins from the ocean, and they have committed to not doing that and continue to commit to not doing that. So there's one way to sort of talk about success in that way, but as far as the sort of ecological success, I think we have to be realistic, like Dan was saying earlier, that like for this specific project, we're very realistic about the limitations of this approach. Like you just, as we had this conversation within our Kelp Alliance meetings, and particularly with our shellfish biologist managers at ODFW, like, well, you can't restore the Orford Reef kelp forest using this method. So we get that. But if we can establish these sort of oases, it seems like there's some evidence that it's a good idea to keep some kelp in the system while we work on these sort of long range changes that are occurring, and maybe we'll see a big shift a decade from now or something. But in the meantime, let's keep some kelp in the system, particularly in areas that people are highly invested in, where divers are saying, like, we really don't want this particular kelp forest to go away. And there's people that are motivated and invested and people willing to support that effort. So if we can do that, I guess that would be kind of like my first pass on an answer to the bigger question about, like, well, what would be success? But all that said, again, we're talking about a lot of effort, as you know, as all you and Dan both know more than I do. So yeah, I guess that's the best I can do right at the moment. Dan, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a tough question. And for those of you who don't know, so Tristan, formerly with Reef Check, is the one who ran that Noyo Harbor project, so she's very familiar with all this. But yeah, I mean, I'd say two things. Like one is, like, I mean, I think, everybody has in their head that, you designate an area, you remove all the urchins, you have a control area, kelp grows back in the area you remove, and it doesn't in the control area. Like that's kind of the design you have, and that's the expected outcome. And yeah, it doesn't always happen. In fact, like, I mean, we've been at this for, I guess going on year 4 here, or year 3 anyways. And we haven't really seen that in a clear way. I mean, even at our Lovers project, where we had 20 different little mini restoration, areas, and we kind of did something different on each one. Like none of them really regrew kelp in a meaningful way. Like we did see some kelp, but you learn, right? And so all these things, there's lessons that you walk away with, and that's how science works, right? It's not just like you do an experiment once and then you got it all figured out. Sometimes you just have to keep adapting. So we've learned a lot about the difficulties in maintaining low densities. So if we're able to achieve that, like this year at Lovers anyways, we're really focusing on that. If we do that and kelp doesn't return, well, maybe our timing was off and we missed that spring season, or maybe we need to seed kelp, or maybe we need to like feed urchins or something, right? Like maybe there's some other component to it. So I mean, I think if you learn something, that's good. And then the other measurement of success, I think, is just engaging people, in this effort and kind of building momentum. And one of the things that we've really discovered or learned in California is that people are willing to go out there and take part in these efforts. And we've just seen like a tremendous amount of sort of outpouring from the community to make these things happen. So and kind of building that community and partnerships.
Yeah, I can't help myself, but I got to ask you, Tristan, what does it look like to you? Since you have some, you know, some experience, and I'm curious, what do you think?
I honestly echo everything you both said. It was almost a loaded question in a certain way, because, you know, I think that is something I think about a lot is you want success to be something tangible. And sometimes that tangible response is kelp. And you talk about the kelp coming back, but if you only have funding for 1 year to remove urchin and reduce that grazing pressure, that measure of success could be far out of reach. And so, but along the way, if you're bringing people along with you and you're teaching the importance of these places and doing like the sorts of trainings that Reef Check does for the public, that could be measured as a win as well. And so, I don't know, I think it was more just a larger conceptual, like for you two who are so engrossed in kind of both aspects of it. How do you kind of balance those two? And I think you answered my question perfectly. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. Thanks for asking the tough questions, Tristan.
Yeah, thanks,
I
Tristan.
appreciate it.
Sorry.
No, it's good. I really appreciate it because it's helpful to sort of step back sometimes from all the details and sort of like, oh, whoa, what are we trying to accomplish here? And I really appreciate that because it's been, for me, it's been super rewarding to just go down this path and realize, wow, there's so many people that are coming from all different perspectives who really care about this. And that's super encouraging. And I think I think we're on the right path, even if it's a long path, we're going in the right direction. So I feel good about that.
Cool. Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
We have a couple more questions. We have, I think you're next, Jeff. I think it's Masson. I'm going to unmute you if you want to speak and just go ahead and ask the question, which is, what is your experience in Oregon on density counts of purples and reds inside marine reserves? Trophic predation and lower densities don't seem to reflect in the data. We have moray, wolf eels, sheephead, crabs, and lobsters, etc. Marine reserves are just as susceptible to the purple invasion, and I agree with your sentiment of the need to create these oases and seed banks. I guess I'll try to unpack some of that. We did, I think I showed on one of the slides, there was some data on density counts of purples and reds at Redfish Rocks. And you might recall that there was a definite increase in density within the marine reserve of both reds and purples. And so, you know, we're paying attention to that. Definitely something worth paying more attention to. And you know, clearly there's no immediate avenue to expand a project like this into the marine reserves, given the current sort of regulations and the fact that Oregon's marine reserves are being evaluated in the next 2 years. So I think there's a very low likelihood of doing a project like this within the marine reserves within the next 2 years. I mean, even though I think it might not be a bad idea, but realistically, I don't see that happening. But I do see room for a conversation about it, because if the marine reserves, you know, if their intention is to conserve biodiversity, and if we are seeing evidence of the loss of biodiversity when a kelp forest habitat flips to an urchin barren, then that may open a door for a conversation about what you might want to do about that. And I think the work we're about to embark on at these different sites is perhaps a way to move toward that conversation. If what we learned from this project is that it's possible to do some focused restoration work and it might work, then maybe we can come to the table and have a deeper conversation about marine protected areas, marine reserves. And I know Dan, you know, Dan has been doing some work in marine protected areas in California. So I know that you guys have sort of tackled that question, obviously.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I agree with all that. Like you're definitely right, Jeff. Like these reserves are not immune to, purple or urchin recruitment, and we definitely see reserves that have, a huge number of urchins. We have reserves that are barrens, and we have areas that are not reserves that are kelp forests for one reason or another. One of the games I like to play in Monterey is like you like swim around and you're like, well, why is that a barren there and why is that a forest there? And you can never, it's so hard to figure out. But when you think of like, even our reserves in California, they don't have sunflower stars. They lost those. They experience the same stressors. The marine heat wave, the urchin explosion. So they're in no way immune. Most of the animals we protect them, like even like wolf eels or moray eels, crabs, things that even things that eat urchins, they don't really eat enough of them to really be a control. In fact, even sunflower stars actually don't eat that many urchins, and they think the main effect that they have on urchins is a behavioral one, is that the urchins kind of run from the sunflower stars and hide. And so like the sunflower stars would keep the urchins in these cracks. Um, like I do know lobsters, which are thought to be a control on urchin. We don't have those in Northern California or Central California, but in Southern California, like on the Channel Islands, they've done studies that do show that like the reserves with lots of big lobsters are more immune or immune is not the right word, resistant to becoming barrens than adjoining areas with fewer lobsters. But yeah, it's complicated. There's a lot of factors. Many of these reserves have not been around very long, so they haven't really had a long time to kind of really establish themselves. But I was diving at Point Lobos on Tuesday, which has been a reserve, is a long-time reserve. It's been a reserve since the 70s, and it's not a total barren, but there's definitely areas of it that are. So yeah, it just really varies. There's a lot of components.
Yeah, thanks for that, Dan. I think it's really interesting to sort of have this, compare and contrast discussion about what's happening in California, what's happening in Oregon. There's similarities, there's differences, but it's really in the end one long coast and one big ecosystem that we're talking about. And I really appreciate that sort of stepping back a bit and sort of taking it all in. A couple more questions from this one's from Laura Tesler, and then Kevin Book has some questions and good suggestions. So Laura, I'll go to you first. Laura wants to talk about her experience over time in Port Orford with fish density. And I unmuted you so you can speak to that. And if you want, I can make you a panelist so we can.
I don't want to be a panelist. You can just hear my squeaky little voice.
All right, there you go. We're hearing
here's my squeaky little voice. So my very first cold water checkout dive was in Nellie's Cove in 2006. And I remember sitting down on the bottom of Nellie's Cove and in that beautiful kelp forest with the sunshine coming down and the black rockfish swimming around me. Well, first of all, thinking I was an idiot for not learning how to dive earlier. And second of all, that's when it all started for me. Like, that's when the cold water switch just flipped for me. I was never really a warm water diver after that, And so for me to return back to where I kind of started and to see Nellie's Cove, where it is today was really shocking, because Nellie's Cove looks very different and Titchener looks very different and Hellgate looks very different. And all of these sites have been completely denuded. And for somebody who has dove there over the years and seen the changes, it is hard not to feel sad because you have seen the complete rise and fall of an ecosystem in a very short time. That's hard. It's hard to see cabezon that should be sitting in holdfasts, that are just sitting basically on, you know, coralline algae now because there's nothing for them to sit on. And they're, you know, so it is hard to see that. And, you know, I kind of wonder, you know, Dan said something kind of profound in one of our classes, and he said, you know, there's always been urchin barons, you know, and there have been always urchin barons through time. But for me, you know, you talk about success. For me, success is having a lot of people trained to be reef check divers in Oregon and have, you know, say, hey, we've trained, you know, 200 people in Oregon, and now we have people that are out doing surveys, and we're doing transects, and we're collecting the information, and we're doing the protocols, and we understand what is happening, and we're getting the information back to make the decisions, to get the, you know, the data to help decision makers make decisions, because ODFW does not have enough people to do this, and we all got to work together. And so for me, I mean, that's the success that, you know, I want to see. And for me as a photographer, it's all about seeing and taking pictures and getting the pictures out. And I took these pictures of Nellie's Cove completely denuded, and those were powerful pictures to people, you know. I mean, people were really affected by seeing how bare it was as compared to what it was. So I think that, you know, the power of showing what we're doing and taking pictures and participating in surveys and getting good information and having good data captains and, you know, getting our act together, that's what's going to make a difference. And that's the business we're in. I mean, I buy for my real job, I buy property with oak forests. We do management plans that have 300-year, you know, timelines. So you're talking to the wrong person when you want to see instant results. It doesn't happen overnight. It's not going to happen overnight. But this is where we're going. This is, and I think for me, that's what's going to turn the time. And it's great to see all these people on this thing tonight. And the thing tomorrow, and we just got to keep doing this kind of stuff. And thank you so much, Tom and Dan. And it was great to see Kristen on here tonight, even though she abandoned us for TNC, but that's okay.
She's still there.
Still there. But we're gonna I think we're gonna, you know, I'm really happy that we're gonna do it in Oregon, because Washington usually gets all the, you know, the beast at the table, and about time Oregon got there first. So yay.
All right.
That's all I want.
Well, that's thanks a lot, Laura. And, you know, just to be honest, I have had that experience as well. And it's pretty heartbreaking to go to a place that you knew as one thing and just see how it has just really transformed, and not in a good way. I think we're pretty close to wrapping, but I want to turn to Kevin Book at this point. And Kevin's our dive safety officer at Oregon State University. And Kevin was responding to the question about success. And I'll read it out. And I've also unmuted Kevin, so chime in at will. But you know, Kevin's saying in a perfect world, success means post-perturbation surveys and monitoring trends that start to shift towards pre-perturbation data. And I guess I would agree, and invite Kevin to expand on that if you like.
Oh, thanks. I mainly just chimed in because somebody earlier had asked some questions about data relating to surveys in the marine reserves, the Oregon Marine Reserves. Mm-hmm. And OSU provides a lot of the dive support for the long-term subtidal monitoring on scuba in the marine reserves. And they just released a new function in their website, their data dashboard, where they've correlated a lot of their MPA and marine reserve survey data that they've collected over the last 5 years, and made it sort of easily mined and accessible through a public portal. So I'll be happy to post that link for folks that maybe haven't seen it. If I post it in the chat, and then I think everybody will be able to see it.
Yeah, thanks for doing that. And I think it's a great tool. I've definitely gone there myself and checked it out and spent some time exploring there, and lots of good
Yeah.
data. But hopefully it's just going to keep growing and getting more and more interesting and useful.
Yeah, and basically what I meant from my comment was we had some natural steady state, relative equilibrium in these places. And for me, is from an ecological point of view, if we could somehow see that we were trending over long-term monitoring and historical surveying, and we were trending back towards those starting points, then I think that would be the ultimate measure of success. I come from a 30-year background in Atlantic coral reefs. And so I lived the diadema die-off and the reef declines in the tropical Western Atlantic. And there's a lot of parallels between what happened there and what's now kind of manifesting itself here on the West Coast. Keystone species, temperature spikes over long years, followed by disease outbreaks, all of that. The parallels are just really striking. And now you've got baseline ecology in the tropical Western Atlantic that looks nothing like what it did even within my working career lifetime. So yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, I can't argue there with you or with anything Laura said. And I guess as we get towards wrapping up, if anyone had any last questions or comments, feel free to throw them up there, or I think you can raise your hand or something. But if not, I guess I'll just sort of wrap things up at this stage by saying, those last few questions and comments really give us pause. And it's tough to face these big issues. But I guess I'll say again what I said earlier, which is that what gives me hope in these situations is to be working with people who are motivated and energized and committed to doing something about it. And even if we don't know how it's going to turn out, if we have an opportunity to act on these opportunities to, be active in our engagement with the natural world around us, at least have a chance to do something to improve things, then maybe that's better than just being in despair, I guess. I don't do well if all I do is think about how everything's just going to keep getting worse and never get better. And I think what we have learned in a lot of other tough situations is that we can work together and we can see positive change. And sometimes it's incremental and takes a long time, like both Laura and Kevin just said. But you got to start somewhere. So I'm encouraged by the fact that we're having these conversations and people are engaged and interested. So I just want to thank everybody for showing up. We did record this, so if you have a friend who wasn't able to make it, we'll share the recording, and I'll invite Dan if you have anything else you want to add to the final minutes.
No. I mean, we kind of ended on a really serious note. I thought everything Laura said was very well said. I mean, it's like it's hard sometimes when you talk about data and numbers, but yeah, there is an emotional side to all of this. I grew up ab diving up in these areas that are now just, they look like World War I battle zones. So yeah, but I am, I'm encouraged. It's great to see, people, coming together. I mean, honestly, I think the reason that I do this job is because I want to be surrounded by people that, feel the same way about these areas that I do. And so it's always, super, gratifying to, dive with other people that are diving for the same reason, and meet people that are so dedicated to protecting these ecosystems, to take their time out of their day. I think that's kind of what keeps me going, because if I wasn't in this world, I think I would just be kind of quietly screaming in a corner. So it's just great to and it's great to kind of reach out and meet this whole like Oregon community, which is so like close to ours, and all this whole world. So so thanks everybody. Those were great questions. Hope you learned something. Please feel free to reach out anytime with any questions or comments.
Excellent. Thanks again, Dan. I see great things for the future of the Reef Check Oregon Kelp Alliance partnership. It's just getting started. It's really exciting, and I'm really looking forward to launching this this new project. It's going to be really interesting and hopefully some fun too. So thanks again, everyone. We're going to sign off and tell your friends, and you can find this. It'll ultimately, the recording will end up on the YouTube channel for the Oregon Kelp Alliance, and Reef Check might find a way to share it as well. So look for that, share it with your friends who couldn't make it, and stay tuned. There'll be more.
All right, bye everyone.
Good night, everybody.